they have a huge impact on the member experience as well. And so we have a whole suite of internal tools for those teams to support them. The last one I want to talk about, I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about, is platform. So I alluded to this earlier, but how you can think about this conceptually and tactically is fundamentally a whole suite of data models and services coupled with internal tools that really own these sources of truth. Now, users of platforms could be other products, so other internal user applications or external user applications, or direct user. So anyone that's accessing that data is also a user as well. As you can imagine, there's a wider breadth of users when you're working on platform. And a couple other things to note here is it's fundamentally focused on thinking about scalability and flexibility. And there's a couple other things in terms of the nuances of the product development cycle. So when we're in build mode, it's a lot harder to test and iterate. Like, you can't really A/B test a platform while you're building. So there's a lot more emphasis on the discovery and the scoping work. So I'll dive into that in a second. So speaking of, thought it'd be helpful to go through the product development lifecycle for a platform. And so very quickly you'll learn it's not that different. First, we start off with a hypothesis. So just like a bunch of user applications, we really need to understand the users of our platform. So we listen to our users, we monitor data, we shadow teams, we look at external players in the industry to see what's happening, and then we come up with a hypothesis on something that we should be working on. So let's take an example. Members, providers, and internal users need to be able to trust that information about OSCA's providers and networks are accurate. Great, that's a way we can start off and kick off a project. The next step is discovery. So we start diving into understanding what we need to know to help refine our hypothesis and get to sort of a definition at the end. So just like when you're building a user application, you go into user experience ecosystem mapping. So you're trying to understand your user, what channels they use, what questions they have, what touch points they touch, what channels they may ask certain questions in, what they may not ask in other channels, really just mapping that out. When you think about a platform, it's actually very similar. So you're actually replacing user with data. So you're trying to understand that data that your platform owns. What are its touch points? Who are the users that use that information? How do they use that information? What actions do they take with it? And so you're going to build out this huge ecosystem of all the players and users in this space that rely on the information that you're working on. Here's a sample set of different things that we did in terms of building out our provider data model platform, but really thinking through all the use cases, everything from building our networks to working with our regulators to paying claims to supporting our virtual care and so much more. The next step is pretty critical, as I mentioned earlier. The development cycle is a lot harder once you start building, so it's really, really important for you to really test your hypotheses with a bunch of different users, and you can do this using prototypes. So if you think about building prototypes for a user application, you're drawing on a piece of paper or cardboard or you have a prototype, and you're really just watching and observing users click on buttons, swipe, read information, navigate. What are they consuming? What are they not understanding? It's pretty similar. So this doesn't need to be heavy investment. I've built prototypes using Google Sheets and Splunk dashboards and Periscope dashboards. And fundamentally, what you're trying to present to users is your set of information and how you would categorize it. And so you would be watching how they use it. So how do they look up this information? What questions do they have about this data? How do they use this data? How do they action it? Does it make sense for their workflows? What are they hungry for that they're not seeing right away? There's also users that are responsible for managing and editing this data. So one thing to note here is this is usually coupled with building internal tools for those users that are editing and managing this data, but for them, you're really thinking about, do they get all the information that they need? Do they understand the implications of the changes that they make? Does the data flow in a way that makes sense to them? You're just really observing, refining, iterating. And really, because this is used by so many people, you have to get in front of a bunch of different users and make sure they're bought into what they're seeing. The next step is defining and validating. So through discovery and prototype testing, you're going to start picking up themes and identifying patterns that you're seeing. And one sort of way to anchor your thoughts around how to think about data is thinking about objects and relationships. So for example, we noticed a lot of users were asking a lot of information about providers. So what services do they provide? Where do they go to school? So if you step back, that is a provider and a bunch of attributes about that provider. So the school they went to, their specialty, et cetera. And typically, those things don't change. There were a lot of users who asked questions about providers and where they practice and whether they accept new patients at those locations. So if you step back there, that's a provider that has a location that they practice at. So there's a provider with a relationship with a location. And for that location-provider relationship, you want to understand whether they accept new patients or they don't. Another thing to note there is that might actually change over time. So where you graduate from doesn't change over time, but you may change practices, you may change whether you're accepting new patients today compared to tomorrow. And so that's another aspect that you have to think about as how you think about people accessing that data. And lastly, users really wanted to know how provider joined our network. So which partner did they come through? What rates should we pay them? So this is when we realized we actually didn't have that information, and so we had to create a new object. So this is a provider related to a contract. And so contract was new to us, and so this contract will represent a lot of the information that users were looking for that we couldn't surface before. Now, when it comes to prioritization, it's pretty analogous to prioritizing a bunch of features that you may have thought through for an application. So you've thought about all these objects, these relationships, you know all the users and their needs, you understand your company's goals. How does that fit into your prioritization framework? You could be using metrics or different other sets of weights to make sure you prioritize the list of things that you're building out. And then last thing, one thing you should note that's pretty important about this space is if you're defining new things, it's sort of your responsibility to make sure the organization understands it. So in this example, we built this new concept of a contract. Now there's a whole bunch of users that now needs to understand what to do with a contract, how it can benefit them. So you're sort of owning this dictionary as well and this concept and making sure to share that with the rest of the organization. And lastly, just like everything else, launch is launching. It makes sure you have to test and communicate everything. There's a lot more people you have to keep in sync. There's a lot of users and a larger breadth that you're going to touch. And so there may be teams that are dependent on you for them to test and make changes themselves. You also have to remember there's a whole bunch of operational users that need to change their workflows to consume this new information, action it, and use it in the ways that are effective for their roles and responsibilities. And then after that, obviously celebrate your launch, and then we go back and do it all over again. So my last thoughts, as you can tell, I've spent a lot of time in this space, and so when Oscar first started, we didn't really have this concept of building our own platform, and now we've actually picked up this gargantuan task of building our own insurance platform, which if anyone's familiar is not a small task, super exciting. But a couple of things that I've learned while working in this space and managing a team of platform product managers. One of the cool things is because of the breadth, you get to work with a huge part of the business. You get to work with different parts of the business that need to work together, and it really helps you gain a better understanding of how a large, complex organization works. As a leader, navigating a large, complex organization also becomes valuable. And so working through complex systems and connecting the dots and who uses that information really translated well for me as I was managing relationships with different stakeholders and helping set up my team for success. And then lastly, it's super fun. If you like puzzles and gnarly problems, I mean, I think you probably saw it in my history. When I was looking for a new role and I landed at Oscar, for me, it was just all about finding like really meaty problems and complex ecosystems, and I landed in like the most complex, regulated, gnarly ecosystem there is, and so it's really, really fun to tackle because there's no shortage of problems. So if this is something you're working on, that's amazing. If it's something you're thinking about exploring, happy to talk about it more, but it's just a ton of fun, and that's all I have. So thank you so much for your time, everyone. I'm happy to take questions.
All right, any questions, folks? We're going to run around with mics so that everyone can hear.